What happens when one apostle publicly confronts another? Not a debate, not a disagreement behind closed doors. Paul stands up and to Peter's face calls out his hypocrisy in front of everyone. That's not a rumor, that's Galatians chapter 2. And by the end of it, Paul will hand us one of the most famous lines in the New Testament, "I've been crucified with Christ." Let's find out how we get there. So last chapter, Paul defended himself. His apostleship wasn't man-made. It came straight from Jesus Christ. Now in Galatians 2, he shows something else. That the other apostles, the ones who walked with Jesus, actually agree with him. We're picking up years later. Paul heads to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus to meet privately with the leaders of the church. Let's hear how that meeting went. Then, after a period of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus also with me. I went up by revelation, and I laid before them the good news which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately before those who were respected, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. This was because of the false brothers secretly brought in, who stole in to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave no place in the way of subjection, not for an hour, that the truth of the good news might continue with you. But from those who were reputed to be important, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God doesn't show partiality to man. They, I say, who were respected, imparted nothing to me. But to the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news for the uncircumcised, even as Peter with the good news for the circumcised. For he who worked through Peter in the apostleship with the circumcised also worked through me with the Gentiles. And when they perceived the grace that was given to me, James and Cephas and John, those who were reputed to be pillars, gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcision. They only asked us to remember the poor, which very thing I was also zealous to do. So here's what's actually happening in this meeting. Paul goes to Jerusalem to lay out privately the gospel he's been preaching to the Gentiles. That salvation comes through faith in Christ, not through keeping the law of Moses. And the result? Nobody adds anything. Titus, a Gentile, isn't required to be circumcised. The pillars of the church, Peter, James, John, don't correct Paul, they confirm him. Not everyone in that room agreed, however. Paul calls out some false brothers who had slipped in to spy on the freedom Gentile believers now had in Christ, trying to drag them back under the law. Paul says he didn't yield to them, not for an hour. That phrase matters. This wasn't some minor disagreement he was willing to let slide for the sake of peace. And then comes the moment that really settles it. James, Peter, and John extend the right hand of fellowship to Paul and Barnabas. That's a formal gesture of unity, an official yes. Paul preaches to the Gentiles, Peter to the Jews, but it's the same gospel, it's the same grace. The only request they make is that Paul remembers the poor, something he said he was already very eager to do. So going into this next section, hold on to that. Peter has already affirmed, formally and publicly, that Gentiles are saved by faith, not by the law. Keep that in mind, because it's about to make what happened next in Antioch even harder to watch. That agreement in Jerusalem should have settled things for good. As it often goes, it didn't hold, at least not for Peter. Once he was somewhere where the pressure felt a little bit closer to home for him. But when Peter came to Antioch, I resisted him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before some people came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in his hypocrisy. so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they didn't walk uprightly according to the truth of the good news, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live as the Gentiles do, and not as the Jews do, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as the Jews do? So let's picture the scene. Peter is in Antioch, and for a while, he's eating at the same table as Gentile believers, something the traditional Jewish approach to the law would never have allowed. He's living out exactly what he agreed to in Jerusalem. Gentiles who trust in Christ are fully accepted by God, full stop. Then some men connected to James showed up. People still uncomfortable with Jewish Christians eating alongside Gentiles, and Peter gets scared. He quietly gets up, separates himself, and because of how much influence Peter carries, the other Jewish believers follow him away from the table. Even Barnabas, Paul's own ministry partner, gets swept up in it. But here's something worth thinking about. Peter didn't change his theology. He still believed Gentiles were justified by faith. What changed was his behavior under social pressure. And that's exactly what hypocrisy is, saying one thing and living another when it's convenient. So Paul does something remarkable. He doesn't pull Peter aside privately. He confronts him before them all, publicly, because the error itself was public and was actively misleading other believers. His question cuts straight to the point. If you, Peter, are willing to live like a Gentile when it suits you, how could you possibly pressure Gentiles to live like Jews? The moment becomes the hinge for the rest of the letter. It's not really about table manners. It's about whether anyone, even an apostle, can act like good behavior, traditions, ritual observance is part of what saves us, which sets up exactly what Paul says next. Paul doesn't just win the argument and move on. He uses this moment to lay out plainly and clearly what he actually believes about how anyone is made right with God. We, being Jews by nature and not Gentile sinners, yet knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ, even we believed in Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because no flesh will be justified by the works of the law. But if while we sought to be justified in Christ, we ourselves were also found sinners, is Christ a servant of sin? Certainly not. For I build up again those things which I destroyed. I prove myself a lawbreaker. For I, through the law, died to the law, that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. That life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. I don't reject the grace of God, for if righteousness is through the law, then Christ died for nothing. This is Paul's grand case, and it applies to Peter, to Paul himself, to everyone. Even born and raised Jews who kept the law their whole lives only became right with God by faith in Christ. Because verse 16 is blunt about it. No flesh will be justified by the works of the law. Not Peter's obedience, not Paul's zeal, faith in Christ or nothing. Verses 19 and 20 are where this gets personal. Paul says, he died to the law so he could live to God. He describes it as being crucified with Christ. His old self, the one trying to earn righteousness, is gone. And what's left isn't Paul running the show anymore. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The Catechism speaks directly to what's happening here in chapter 1992. That teaches, justification has been merited for us by the passion of Christ, who offered himself on the cross as a living victim, holy and pleasing to God. Not something we merit ourselves, something Christ has already merited and gives. There's a saint whose own words land right alongside Paul's here. Saint Therese of Lisieux, near the end of her life, wrote in A Story of a Soul that she did not want to lay up merits for heaven, and that she would appear before God with empty hands, asking only to be clothed in His own justice. That's Galatians 2 in a single image. Coming to God not with a resume of good works, but empty-handed, trusting Christ's righteousness instead of our own. And that's why Paul ends this section the way he does. If righteousness is through the law, then Christ died for nothing. If we could have earned it ourselves, the cross wouldn't have been necessary. The fact that Christ had to die is the proof that we couldn't. So here's Galatians 2 in one line. The gospel Paul preaches is the same gospel the other apostles preach, and it holds no matter who's watching, even when an apostle like Peter momentarily forgets that under pressure. Justification comes by faith in Christ alone, and once you've been crucified with Him, it's no longer about your own effort. It's Christ living in you. Here's something to think about today. Is there an area of your life where you say you believe one thing, but under social pressure, you quietly live another? If this at all helped Galatians 2 click for you, hit subscribe, like the video, share it with everyone you've ever met. Galatians 3 is coming up next, where Paul asks the Galatians a question that gets right to the heart of everything that we just covered. And drop a comment below. I read every one of them. What part of this confrontation stood out to you the most? I'll see you all in Galatians 3.